In the Sufi tradition, spiritual development is not an abstract theological concept, but a practical, hands-on endeavor often described through the metaphor of gardening. The human heart is understood as a plot of fertile soil capable of producing extraordinary beauty or troublesome weeds, depending on how it is tended. This garden metaphor appears consistently throughout Sufi poetry, teaching stories, and practical manuals. The Persian poet Rumi wrote, "Your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it." Like a gardener removing obstacles to growth, the spiritual practitioner works to clear away what blocks the natural unfolding of inner virtues. What makes these seeds in the dark is that inner cultivation requires faith in processes we cannot directly observe. The gardener plants in darkness, both the literal darkness of soil and the metaphorical darkness of working beneath the surface of consciousness. Sufis understood this hidden terrain to be as real and subject to natural laws as any earthly garden. Just as seeds germinate unseen before they break through soil, virtues develop through invisible processes before manifesting in behavior. And just as neglected land becomes overgrown with whatever seeds happen to fall upon it, the untended heart develops according to unconscious patterns and external influences rather than conscious cultivation. In this exploration, we'll discover how Sufis develop sophisticated methods for tending the garden of the heart. Practical techniques for cultivating virtues, removing vices, and creating optimal conditions for spiritual flourishing that remain remarkably relevant for contemporary life. In the Sufi gardening metaphor, the human heart represents the soil in which virtues and vices take root. The Arabic word for heart, qalb, implies something that turns or changes, suggesting soil that can be worked, transformed, and prepared for cultivation. The condition of this soil determines what can grow within it. The 11th century Persian Sufi master Al-Ghazali described 4 possible states of the heart soil. First is the hardened heart, like compacted soil that resists water and nutrients, preventing seeds from taking root. This represents the condition where attachment to material concerns, habitual patterns, and self-centeredness creates resistance to spiritual qualities. Second is the scattered heart, like loose, windy soil where seeds blow away before they can establish roots. This represents the condition of distraction, inconsistency, and lack of focus that prevents virtues from becoming established. Third is the contaminated heart, like soil with toxic elements that distort growth. This represents the condition where underlying resentments, hidden agendas, or unconscious fears poison otherwise healthy development. Fourth is the receptive heart, like well-prepared soil with the right balance of structure and openness. This represents the condition of readiness for cultivation, where virtues can establish deep roots and flourish. The initial work of heart gardening involves assessing and preparing this inner soil. The 12th century Andalusian Sufi Ibn Arabi taught, "Before planting, know your soil." Some hearts need softening through practices of love and beauty. Others need structure through practices of discipline and commitment. Others need purification through practices of honesty and self-examination. This soil preparation includes specific techniques. For the hardened heart, the practice of breaking ground through zikr, rhythmic remembrance, that creates receptive openness where rigid patterns once dominated. For the scattered heart, the practice of creating boundaries through regular meditation that develops the capacity to hold attention steadily on what matters most. For the contaminated heart, the practice of purification through muhasabah, self-accounting, that brings awareness to hidden toxins within consciousness. The Sufi tradition emphasized that soil preparation is not a one-time task, but ongoing maintenance. As the Persian Sufi poet Hafiz wrote, "Each morning is a new opportunity to turn the soil of your heart, removing whatever stones of forgetfulness accumulated during the night." This perspective transforms daily spiritual practice from obligation into essential gardening maintenance, the regular tending that keeps the soil of the heart receptive to virtues that might otherwise find no place to root. Within the prepared soil of the heart, Sufis recognize two types of growth: the intentionally planted seeds of virtue, fadail, and the spontaneously appearing weeds of vice, radhail. Both require different forms of attention from the inner gardener. The seeds of virtue include qualities like patience, sabr, gratitude, shukr, compassion, rahmah, generosity, sakhay, and truthfulness, sidq. Each virtue was understood to have specific requirements for successful cultivation, just as different plants need different growing conditions. The 13th century Persian Sufi Najm al-Din Razi provided detailed cultivation instructions for various virtues. Patience requires the sunny exposure of challenge and difficulty, without which it cannot develop properly. The inner gardener creates optimal conditions by consciously accepting necessary struggles rather than avoiding them. Gratitude needs the regular watering of conscious appreciation. The practice involves deliberately noticing blessings that might otherwise be taken for granted, giving the seed of thankfulness the moisture it needs to grow. Compassion develops best with broad exposure to both suffering and beauty, which together stimulate its growth. The gardening practice involves remaining open to the full range of human experience without closing down or becoming selectively numb. These cultivation practices require discernment about timing and conditions. The 11th century Sufi master al-Kushairi taught, "Plant each virtue in its proper season. Some qualities grow best beginning in difficulty. Others require initial protection and nurturing." The wise gardener knows when to plant each seed. Alongside intentional cultivation of virtues comes the necessary work of addressing vices, the weeds that appear without invitation and compete for resources in the heart soil. These include qualities like pride, kubr, envy, hasd, greed, tamar, and resentment, huqd. The Sufi approach to these unwanted growths was nuanced. Unlike some religious traditions that emphasize battling against vices, Sufis often took a more ecological approach based on understanding the function of weeds in the garden system. The 12th century Sufi Al-Qadir al-Jilani taught, "Weeds indicate something about the condition of the soil. Rather than merely attacking them, learn what they reveal about what your heart needs." This perspective transforms even negative qualities into sources of information for the inner gardener. 3 approaches to weeds appear in Sufi practice. Direct removal, uprooting unwanted qualities through practices of tawbah, repentance, turning, that consciously release habitual patterns. Displacement, planting desirable virtues so densely that weeds find no room to establish themselves. The 10th century Sufi Abu Sa'id Abil Khair advised, "Fill your heart so full with remembrance of the divine that forgetfulness can find no place to root." Transformation. Composting negative qualities into nourishment for positive growth. This alchemical approach recognizes that even vices contain energy that can be redirected. As Rumi wrote, "The wound is where the light enters you," suggesting that even painful or difficult aspects of ourselves can become openings for growth when properly transformed. This balanced approach to cultivation and removal creates a dynamic, living garden rather than a static or controlled environment, reflecting the Sufi understanding that spiritual development is an ongoing, organic process rather than a destination to be reached. Beyond soil preparation and seed selection, the Sufi garden metaphor extends to the elements required for spiritual growth. Just as physical plants need specific proportions of water, light, air, and nutrients, virtues require particular elements to flourish. Water in the inner garden represents divine grace or baraka, the spiritual nourishment that cannot be manufactured but must be received. The 9th century female Sufi saint Rabia described practices for becoming receptive to this essential element. Open yourself to grace as a flower opens to rain, neither grasping nor refusing, but simply receiving what comes as gift. The practical technique for this receptivity was developed especially in the North African Sufi tradition. It involves cultivating a state called expansion, bast, a quality of open receptivity without demand or expectation. The practice begins with physical relaxation that gradually extends to emotional and mental openness, creating conditions where grace can be absorbed. Sunlight in the inner garden represents conscious awareness or presence, the focused attention that energizes growth. The Persian Sufi tradition emphasized the transformative power of sustained awareness directed toward emerging virtues. As the poet Rumi wrote, "What you pay attention to grows. Whatever you focus your consciousness upon will develop like a plant turning towards sunlight." The practical technique involves what the Naqshbandi Sufi order called watchfulness, muraqaba, the practice of giving sustained attention to a specific virtue one wishes to develop. This involves both formal meditation periods and moment-to-moment mindfulness that directs awareness toward the desired quality throughout daily activities. Air in the inner garden represents space and freedom, the necessity of not overcrowding or over-controlling growth. The 13th century Turkish Sufi poet Yunus Emre taught, "The garden of the heart needs open space where unexpected beauty can emerge. Do not fill every inch with your plans and designs." The practical implementation involves what contemporary Sufi teacher Kabir Helminski calls creative emptiness, the practice of maintaining areas of openness in daily life and consciousness where spontaneous growth can occur. This includes time without agenda, meditation without specific focus, and receptivity to what wants to emerge naturally. Nutrients in the inner garden represent the specific nourishment each virtue requires. The 12th century Persian Sufi Ahmad Ghazali developed detailed understanding of the nutritional needs of different qualities. Courage requires the nourishment of gradually increasing challenges. The practice involves deliberately engaging with progressively larger fears, providing the specific nutrient that this virtue needs to develop. Generosity requires the nourishment of regularly giving beyond comfort. The practice involves consistently sharing resources in ways that stretch the heart's capacity, providing the specific food this quality needs to grow. Humility requires the nourishment of accurate self-perception. The practice involves honestly acknowledging both strengths and limitations without exaggeration in either direction, providing the balanced diet this virtue requires. The Sufi gardener thus works with awareness of these elements, creating optimal conditions for the growth of specific virtues rather than trying to force development through willpower alone. As the Persian poet Sadi Shirazi wrote, "You cannot command a rosebud to open, but you can create conditions where it naturally blossoms in its own time." The Sufi garden metaphor extends to include understanding of seasonal cycles and growth patterns in spiritual development. Just as physical gardens move through distinct phases, the garden of the heart experiences its own rhythms and stages. The seasonal cycle begins with spring, periods of enthusiasm and new growth where virtues seem to develop rapidly with minimal effort. The Sufi tradition recognized these seasons as both valuable and temporary. The 10th century Persian Sufi Abu Sa'id Abil Khair advised, "When the spring of spiritual opening arrives, plant as many seeds as possible. Don't waste this fertile time with hesitation or doubt." The practical approach to these spring seasons involves what the Chishti Sufi order called harvesting the fruit of states. Using periods of natural enthusiasm and energy to establish patterns and practices that can be maintained through more challenging seasons. Summer represents periods of intensity and testing, where growth continues but requires more attention and care. The Andalusian Sufi tradition described this as the season where the garden reveals which plantings have real roots and which were merely surface enthusiasm. The practice for summer seasons involves what Ibn Ata'illah al-Iskandari called persistence beyond pleasure. Continuing to water and tend virtues even when the initial excitement has faded and the work has become more demanding. Autumn represents periods of letting go and discernment, where some initiatives are recognized as complete, while others are selected for deeper development. The Persian Sufi tradition emphasized the importance of this season for spiritual maturation. The practice for autumn involves what the 14th century Kubrawi Sufi tradition called the harvest of wisdom. Consciously integrating lessons from experience and distinguishing which elements of practice should be preserved for the future and which have fulfilled their purpose. Winter represents periods of apparent dormancy and inner work, where visible growth pauses but essential development continues beneath the surface. The Turkish Sufi tradition particularly honored this season as necessary for depth. The practice for winter involves what the poet Rumi called the work of waiting. Maintaining faith in the invisible processes of growth and using the dormant period for deepening roots rather than demanding premature flowering. Beyond seasonal cycles, Sufis recognize specific growth patterns for different virtues. Some virtues develop through gradual, steady growth, like trees that add rings year by year. Qualities like patience and perseverance typically follow this pattern, developing incrementally through consistent practice. Other virtues develop through cycles of breakthrough and integration, like plants that grow in distinct spurts followed by periods of stabilization. Qualities like compassion and insight often follow this pattern, expanding suddenly in response to specific experiences, then requiring time to become fully incorporated. Still others develop through crisis and transformation, like certain seeds that require the shock of fire or frost to germinate. Qualities like forgiveness and surrender sometimes emerge most powerfully through challenging circumstances that break open the heart's defenses. Understanding these patterns helps the inner gardener work with, rather than against, the natural cycles of development. As the 13th century Persian Sufi poet Mahmud Shabistari wrote, "The wise gardener knows that winter's barrenness and summer's abundance are both essential parts of the same growth process. Neither should be rejected, neither can be permanent." The Sufi understanding of heart gardening ultimately points toward a lifelong practice rather than a project to be completed. The garden is never finished, but continues to evolve through changing seasons and circumstances, requiring ongoing attention and care. As the Persian Sufi poet Sadi Shirazi wrote in his famous work, The Rose Garden, "If of your mortal goods you are bereft, and from your slender store 2 loaves alone to you are left, sell one, and with the dole buy hyacinths to feed the soul." This prioritization of inner cultivation, even amid material limitation, reflects the central importance of heart gardening in the Sufi tradition. The continuous nature of this gardening offers both challenge and comfort. The challenge lies in recognizing that spiritual development is never complete. There is always more weeding to do, new seeds to plant, changing conditions to adapt to. The comfort comes from understanding that temporary difficulties or apparent setbacks are simply parts of the natural growing cycle rather than failures. For contemporary practitioners, this perspective transforms spiritual practice from a goal-oriented endeavor focused on achievement into a relationship-based engagement with the living reality of our own consciousness. As Rumi expressed it, "Your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it." In this way, the garden metaphor invites us into an ongoing, intimate relationship with our own inner landscape, tending it with both the practical wisdom of experienced gardeners and the wonder of those who still marvel at the miracle of growth itself. In this way, the garden metaphor invites us into an ongoing, intimate relationship with our own inner landscape. As we cultivate this invisible garden, we discover what the Sufi tradition has always taught, that the fruits of inner cultivation naturally extend beyond the individual heart to nourish the larger world. In the words of a Sufi proverb, "Plant the seeds of virtue in the soil of your heart, and the fragrance will perfume the world."